LiDAR. What is LiDAR? LiDAR is the same thing as radar, just spelled differently. Light detecting and ranging. Radar's case, it's radio detecting and ranging. Both of them work off the same principle. Shoot a beam of magic wuju energy. Tell where in space this point is. To elaborate a bit more on how that distance measurement is made, if we got the LiDAR here and we know the time taken for that beam to travel there and back, and the speed of light, which is represented typically by c, 3 times 10 to the 8 meters per second, then using the classic speed, distance, time triangle, we can say that point is a distance of c times t meters away from the LiDAR. And if we furthermore know the angle that this beam is shot at, we can get exactly where in three-dimensional space with reference to this LiDAR that this object is sitting. Look. Take everything I'm about to tell you with a pinch of salt, because I'm not a scientist, I'm an engineer. I beat up pieces of metal with a wrench until they do cool things. Light is on a spectrum, and it can be divided up like so. For those who don't like graphs, this NM stands for nanometers, which is very, very small. I'm still very much trying to work out at what level I want to pitch these videos, but upon editing that last bit, that was a really terrible explanation. Okay, so to give a little bit of background, light behaves like a wave. Kind of, sometimes, too much of an engineer to really get into that. I will be blasphemed online. But basically, it moves something like that. And when we talk about wavelength, we're talking about how long these little whoops. That wavelength determines certain properties of the light. And in terms of the visible light spectrum, it determines the color we perceive it as.
Way too much wind. Blue light have small wavelengths. Red light have long wavelengths.
So a little fun consequence of that. If you look at this little diagram, we got you on Earth. When the sun is directly in the middle of the sky, shining straight down, it only has a small amount of atmosphere to shine down through. But when it's on the side like that, and essentially at sunset, the light passes through a lot more of the Earth's atmosphere. Blue light, which has a small wavelength, will then be much more likely to hit particles on its way through this atmosphere. Whereas red light, which has the long wavelength, will kind of be more likely to pass straight through it. As a consequence, sunsets are red. So when light has a wavelength of roughly 380 to 720 nanometers, we can see it with our own naked eye. And just a little bit on is the wavelength that LiDARs transmit and receive in LiDAR land. And as that wavelength gets a little bit longer to 4 millimeters to 12. Because of this long wavelength, the radar can see through things that we can't, because at this wavelength, light bounces off, whereas this wavelength, it goes straight through. So to think of radar as the red light that passes through things, LiDAR is the blue light that bounces off things. So you can see LiDAR and radar are essentially the same thing, just at different wavelengths. So why put it on my sensor suite? This is what a standard camera can see. No depth information whatsoever. But a LiDAR, on the other hand, I really hope that works out in post. The other thing that a LiDAR can do that a normal camera can't is this. It has no problem seeing in the dark, and that's because it's an active sensor. An active sensor is a sensor that transmits its own energy. So for example, a camera like the one I'm using now just absorbs light from the environment, whereas a LiDAR produces it. There are three main types of LiDAR, and I will demonstrate them through the art of performance. The first type is called a solid-state LiDAR, and they have less moving parts. They're generally cheaper than the alternatives, and they have a smaller field of view. They work by shining a single laser off a mirror that can be moved, and through that changing mirror, they get the scene in front of them. The second type is called a mechanical LiDAR. And they have an array of lasers that are mechanically rotated, and through that method they scan the scene around them. And lastly, there's the flash LiDAR. This works by taking a whole array of lasers and shooting them all at once. Here in the lab we have access to 4 LiDARs. This little guy's called the Voyager, and he's got an Ouster OS3 on top.
I lied, it's an Ouster OS1.
This is a mechanical LiDAR. You can see the window that the lasers turn through. He's a bit crap. Does this guy look familiar? This is the Ouster OS2 that you saw in the last video. This guy is the price of a car. This was one of my candidates that I chose to experiment with. And then we have the LiVox Avia. This is a solid state LiDAR. You can see that because it's only got one window at the front, and this is where the laser is reflected out by the mirror. So nothing turns like in the other two. We do have other LiVoxes, but this one, just off spec, seemed more suited. It's the first day back in varsity for most of the undergrads. But there's no one here, because the SRC is protesting. I was gonna come here to film, but it seems like there's a rugby game happening. Congrats, man. The SRC are protesting the rugby as well. Well, back to the lab, I guess.
Tu dors encore à mes côtés. Les deux soleils.
So basically, this is a loud chair. So basically, it was a choice between the LiVox Avia and the Ouster OS2. So back in 2024, I began by doing a bit of a specification comparison between the Avia and the OS2. In terms of range, they are pretty similar. In terms of the amount of points that they get per second, OS2 is about 2 times that of the Avia. It's also about 20 times the price. The other and most important and significant difference is the scanning pattern. OS2, mechanical LiDAR, beams in an array, spin, full circle, 360 degrees. Avia, single laser, follows Rosetta pattern. Once it completes one cycle, the Rosetta pattern rotates. Important characteristic, focal point.
Focal point in this context means not really like a camera where it's in focus. Focal point in this context means point density. So where the focal point is, there's a higher density of points.
Back in 2023, during my final year undergrad project, I ran an experiment with the LiVox Avia. This involved putting a box of known dimensions at increasing distances away from it, and then seeing how well it could distinguish that box from the rest of the environment. The experimental setup was simple. LiVox, battery pack, computer, free labor, rugby field. You'll realize the rugby field is pretty much my pseudo Antarctica. Box of known dimensions. The results were quite interesting. Firstly, right off the bat, you could see quite clearly the focal point created by the center of that Rosetta pattern. This is indicated by the increased point density. But generally speaking, there is quite a high point density across the image. Secondly, once the background's been removed, one can quite clearly see the box, at least two sides of it. When it came to running the same experiment with Fat Boy over here, I was absolutely petrified to break it and send the entire Jones lineage into bankruptcy. Because of that, I printed probably the thickest 3D print tripod mount the world has ever seen. I fully expected the significantly larger price tag to be accompanied by significantly increased performance, but I think I learned an important lesson. Sensors are generally designed for specific use cases, and just because the OS2 is more expensive doesn't mean it was necessarily designed for my use case. The OS2 was primarily designed to give autonomous vehicles vision. The 360 degrees of vision isn't useful in my case, as 180 of those degrees would be looking straight back at a boat. Secondly, a car doesn't really care about finer details like the shape of the bonnet of the car that it's about to T-bone directly in front of it. Because of that, the resolution isn't that high. And you can see this in the results. You can notice that the pattern now is a circular pattern as expected from the motion of the mechanical LiDAR. But also, the points aren't that close together. So even though the OS2 gets more points per second, they're spread over a larger field of view. And when we examine the box in more detail, there's only really 2 lines of points. I'm not going to be able to get enough information from that to get the size and shape of an ice floe to determine how it interacts with the ocean waves. So even if it is 20 times the price, I would be paying for features that I don't even need. This makes the LiVox Avia our clear-cut winner and the first sensor to be added to our sensor suite. So I'm still very new to this whole thing and I'm kind of just working it out as I go.
While I'm editing this, some of the things I say might not make sense to you. So if you have any questions, feel free to drop them down in the comment section below.
So that's all from me this week. See you next time. Bye bye.
Comme chaque matin, j'ai de la chance.